It's always nice to invite an old friend of Community Church of Boston to speak, and certainly Sister Jeanne Gallo is such a friend of this church and of many of us. We all deeply appreciate her wisdom and insights, her experience, and her contribution to struggles for human rights and justice, locally as well as nationally and internationally. Jeanne is a human rights educator and activist, a member of the Sisters of Notre Dame, Boston Province. She taught a course on world hunger at Boston College. She was co-director for 3 years of Overview Latin America. And she is here today to deal with national security and the rights of the poor. I'm pleased to present to you Sister Jeanne Gallo.
Thank you very much, Bill. And I want to offer my thanks to Carolyn for that music and for David for his talk as well. They're hard acts to follow. The title of my talk, National Rights, National Security, and the Rights of the Poor, I just want to explain what I'm going to try to do with that. The question of national security, from my perspective, is a particular worldview that people have today who are running most of the world. The concept, the rights of the poor, is very specific for me. I'm named as a human rights activist, but at this point in time, I'm not using the term human rights. Most people who are working with change and change in the third world are working with the concept of the rights of the poor, because human rights includes a lot of other people. And at this point in time, the people who really don't have any rights are the poor. So it's very, very specific, and I'm being very specific for that reason. What I'm going to try to do is to place my talk in the context of Central America, because that's the area of the world that I am most concerned with at this moment, as many of us are, and as I think we have to be, because that is the area of the world where U.S. policy and the war policy that this government makes is being played out in a very, very real way for thousands and thousands of people. Central America is a region where destruction and terror and murder take place daily. Just in the last 6 years, the cost of the wars that are being waged there, and there are a number of wars being waged there, has been staggering. There's been over 150,000 people killed in that region in these last 6 years, and there have been over 2 million displaced, refugees within countries and refugees outside of countries. None of this is new. This has happened before in our history. But I focus on Central America and to use it as an example, and I'll come back to it after I give you some information that I want to share. When I analyze the situation in Central America, I find that there are two worldviews operating, one dealing with national security and one dealing with the rights of the poor. And basically, I could classify them as belonging to groups that are dominators and groups that are mostly poor people, very specific. In some way, I'm looking at this in a class analysis kind of way. The world is, for me, separated into those two groups at this point. Racism is involved in it, but in terms of what is happening in the world, we have those who are the dominators in the world and those who are the poor in the world. And there's a clash, a struggle going on at this moment, very decisively in Latin America on that. The dominating group names Soviet, Cuban, Nicaraguan subversion as the key to the conflict taking place in the region, while the poor, and those of us who have chosen to stand with them, see as key a system of institutionalized violence and injustice. The dominating group claims to be struggling against a foreign enemy, intent on gaining control in the region, while the poor see insurgency and revolution as a last resort in their struggle to build a new society, a society in which all men and women will live with dignity One view organizes itself under the aegis of national security, and the other view looks to organizing a social order that puts the rights of the poor at the center of it. Where do these two views come from? I want to look at the U.S. specifically because basically national security ideology arises out of our own history. And then I'll look at the rights of the poor and make some comments on that. Some of this you know, but I'm going to repeat it because it's worth knowing. It helps us to understand why the U.S. functions as it does in all parts of the world. The geopolitical conception that the U.S. has in the world, how it views geography and history, is important to how it makes its policy. With the end of World War II, the United States emerged from that war a giant of a power, while Europe and Japan and much of the rest of the world emerged as a bombed-out shambles. Plans had been underway as early as 1939 to create a new global economic order, an order which would be managed and which would be dominated by the United States. The ultimate success of this plan, the planning that took place, which Chomsky in a major talk last year, and which you can read about in a book called The Imperial Brain Trust, calls it grand area planning. But the ultimate success of that plan has been evident by the fact that the U.S. has been the major world power in the system of world power for over a quarter of a century. It was very successful. The grand area was to be a region that was subordinated to the needs of the U.S. and to the economy of the United States. It was to be the region that is strategically necessary for world control, as one planner described it. And the grand area had to include the Western Hemisphere, the Far East, the former British Empire, Western and Southern Europe, and the oil-producing regions of the Middle East. In short, it was to include everything, if that were possible. And our leadership at this point really thinks it's possible. By means of massive economic and military assistance programs, such as the Marshall Plan and NATO, the U.S. rebuilt Europe and Japan, and at the same time it refused to rebuild an ally of ours during that war, the Soviet Union. The post-war international trade and monetary system operated under the rules of free trade, which meant the unobstructed flow of money, goods, and services between countries. And all member countries at that time were supposed to play by the rules of the game that had been designed mainly by and for U.S. interests. Tremendous concentration of wealth and productive capacity took place during this period, and we saw the ultimate emergence of what has come to be known as the transnational corporation. Since these corporations have interests in every part of the globe, they need to have protection for those interests. And for this purpose, a whole system of military defense was organized and put in place in Europe, the Near East, the Far East, and Latin America. The doctrine to develop such a system was articulated and developed at the National War College in Washington, D.C., which was founded in 1948, basically to train our Joint Chiefs of Staff and our military officers and other people in Latin America, many of whom in these last years have been heads of government there under the military regimes that they established. Joseph Comblan, a Belgian living in Brazil, has traced the doctrine that came out of that school and has shown how Latin American nations have followed it to its logical conclusion with devastating consequences for their populations. All you have to read is Penny Lanou's Cry of the People, and you will get a horror story, story by story. It's a chamber of horrors to read. My main interest is not in showing how the doctrine has been translated into the national security states, which have been the norm in Latin America, but rather how the U.S. government uses it to justify its policy in Central America, and specifically to justify that policy to people here in the U.S. As the U.S. moved onto the world stage as a world power at the end of World War II, there was a need to convince the U.S. population to accept this reality as coherent with their history and their values. The existence of the Soviet Union provided the enemy needed to do this, and it also provided the rationale needed to elevate national interests and national security to positions of supreme importance in framing U.S. foreign policy. George Kennan, who was head of the State Department policy planning staff in the late 40s, a time when Grand Area Planning was being put into operation, pointed out what the underlying reasons behind all of this was. And he said, we have about 50% of the world's wealth and only 6.3% of its population. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain the position of disparity. We need not deceive ourselves that we can afford today the luxury of altruism and world benefaction. We should cease to talk about vague and unreal objectives such as human rights, the raising of living standards, and democratization. The day is not far off when we are going to have to deal in straight power concepts. The less we are hampered by idealistic slogans, the better. He wrote that in late 1940. He wrote it at the very time when the UN Declaration on Human Rights was being articulated and promulgated in the United Nations by the United States. He called it idealistic, and he called it unreal. So with the context of planning for the new social order, the Cold War began. National interests and national security became the declared objective, in a sense the only objective of government. Two new institutions were created at this time to direct national security policy: the National Security Council and a secret service, the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, which was to be controlled by the National Security Council, and which is controlled by the National Security Council. And I think we have to keep that in mind. The NSC changed the balance of power in U.S. politics. For the executive branch of government through this agency reserved for itself the direction, supervision, and responsibility for defense and foreign policy. The struggle between President Reagan and Congress today over who is to direct the war policy in Central America can be traced back to the enactment of this agency. That was founded in 1947. Again, at the same time that Kennan was speaking and at the same time that the UN was forming the document on human rights. Combland notes that the new institutions developed for security are, quote, building a new pattern for the state, wherein the traditional legislative, executive, and judicial powers are nothing but administrative services functioning under the real power, the new institutions. And he goes on to say, any institutions that have so changed society need an ideology, because it is in the new institutions of the state have one. He calls it the national security ideology, because it is the ideology of the national security system, the new political system of today. It covers virtually all individual and social activities of the nation and gives a new meaning to all human existence. Nothing counts in the world except national security in this perspective. Everything else is subordinated to it. Human rights, democracy, everything. The national security ideology uses two basic sciences, geopolitics, and this particular science includes also a concept known as bipolarity, and strategy, or the art of war, is the other science. Now, what is meant by geopolitics? The basic definition that is used comes from someone who is very familiar to us. His name is General Pinochet in Chile. Pinochet was an ex-teacher of geopolitics. He was also trained at the National Law School in Washington. And he said, geopolitics is the science that studies the influence of geographical and historical factors on the life and evolution of the states in order to arrive at political solutions. It serves as a guide for statesmen in managing both internal and external politics, and it directs the military in preparing the national defense and in working out strategy. For geopolitics makes it easier to forecast future events. It provides a way to obtain objectives and consequently offers a means for the most suitable for political policies. For geopoliticians, people like Pinochet, the state is a living organism, and as such it grows and it takes up space. It needs to grow. Implied in that is that it needs space within which to grow and which to expand. But it's limited in its territory, and thus in order to move into the territory of other states, its need for power and the free exercise of that power is essential. How does this doctrine justify taking territory from other states? This is where the concept of bipolarity is used to support the ideology. Bipolarity defines the world as permanently divided into two camps. There is a hotland, that is, a key region which is the object of struggle between all the world powers. For whoever controls this area will dominate the world. That's why the Middle East is so important to us at this point, because of its resources, and the Far East because of the resources. When the concept was initially developed, the world powers were England and Germany. Today, they are the United States and the Soviet Union. The idea of a permanent struggle between two powers for world hegemony is what is important to note as inherent in the ideology of national security. The ability to exercise power is crucial to the survival and expansion of the state in this struggle. Central America can be seen in this context then, because it becomes clear why the loss of Nicaragua or El Salvador or any country in the U.S. orbit would be seen as a threat to the national security of the U.S. If the state needs territory to grow, to live, then any loss of territory will be a threat to its survival in this system. The idea of a bipolar world and the permanent struggle between two superpowers means that everything is seen as being in a continual state of war. There is no such thing as peace. It doesn't exist. And so the worldview of the Reagan administration, as stated in the opening paragraphs of the Santa Fe document, which was published by the Council on Inter-American Security in 1980, before Reagan came into office, makes sense. And this is what that document says. Nations exist only in relation to each other. Foreign policy is the instrument by which people seek to assure their survival in a hostile world. That's true. But the important part is this next statement. War, not peace, is the norm in international affairs. All peoples, all nations are permanently in a state of war. Thus, the rationale for a resurgent America, a rearmed America, with its militarization of the economy, our own economy, and the economies of other places in the world, necessarily follows. All political decisions are made within this framework. What this means in terms of people is both on the domestic scene as social programs are cut, and in countries like El Salvador, Guatemala, and Nicaragua, where death and destruction are rampant as the U.S. arms and supplies the region. Because the world is divided into two camps, nations are thereby defined as to which camp they are in. If a nation is not in the U.S. camp, is not our ally, if it is not anti-Soviet or anti-Cuban, then it must be on the other side. It is named as the enemy, and then destroying it becomes legitimated. And I'd like to point out, it's not a question of whether a nation is communist that defines its relationship with U.S. policymakers. It is for us, because that's what we're told is the enemy, is communism. What's clear this is clear from President Reagan's China trip and that of Vice President Bush just this past week. They both have gone to China, the largest communist country in the world. It is whether a nation is perceived as being in opposition to the enemy, who is at the moment the Soviet Union. That's what defines relationships for us. Also to be noted in this view is that revolutionary war, or wars of liberation, wars for the rights of the poor, are not seen as involving only the people in the government of that nation. In this worldview, there is only one war, and all other struggles are defined in relation to that war. Again, if a government is a friend, an ally in the struggle against the enemy, the Soviet Union, it will be given what it needs to put its population down, no matter how repressive that government is with its people, no matter how many people it kills. What is important is that the integrity of the state be preserved. And since the state is synonymous with the nation, and the nation and its security are the ultimate value, A revolutionary population threatens that security, and in the logic of national security ideology and grand area planning, the security of the United States. The Reagan administration and the Congress say this over and over again as their rationale for providing the government of El Salvador all it needs to control its population, and all that the Contras on the Nicaraguan border need to overthrow the Nicaraguan government. Both the administration and the Congress name liberation struggles as a threat to national security. This is why we have supported, as a country, and continue to support repressive regimes against their own people who are seen as being in collusion with the enemy, and in fact, in this system, they are named as the enemy. As one geopolitician wrote, national security is the guarantee given by the state to obtain or defend the national interests, regardless of antagonisms or other forces. The response to the Soviet threat is to secure the nation, and to do this, whatever force needed will be used. There is no distinction made between violent and nonviolent means, or between preventive violence and repressive violence. All is the same. All is justified, whether it be support for the government of El Salvador or Guatemala, the militarization of Honduras so as to make the entire country a base for the United States, or the creating of an army to overthrow the government of Nicaragua. I'd like to give some specific examples of how this policy is played out and what is legitimated. First, in El Salvador, death squads linked to the government eliminate whatever population, whatever opposition is seen as a threat to national security, which in El Salvador means to the continued control of the nation's resources by the oligarchy. The link between these death squads and the U.S. government was exposed last year in the Progressive magazine. In the bloody war that has been going on since 1979, over 60,000 Salvadorans have been murdered, and over 1 million refugees created. Most of these murders were committed by U.S.-backed, U.S.-paid military forces, including the death squads previously mentioned. The Council on Hemispheric Affairs has estimated that close to 3,000 civilians have died in rural areas of El Salvador in the first half of this year alone. 3,000. Because of the air war that's now taking place there. U.S. surveillance and intelligence assistance plays a major role in this air war. U.S. pilots fly a dozen OV-10 flights daily out of Panama and Honduras. These planes, equipped with infrared sensors, locate groups of people by detecting their body heat. They then relay their whereabouts to Salvadoran ground forces. The U.S. is also using drones, or pilotless planes, to fly reconnaissance missions in El Salvador. Drones can fly over an area and send TV images back without risking the lives of air crews. This is all reminiscent of Vietnam. This is where the technology came from. The U.S. embassy officials and the Salvadoran government maintain that civilians have not been bombed. Critics have pointed out, however, that the Salvadoran security forces have a strategy of, quote, removing the sea from the fish, end of quote. The fish being the guerrillas and the sea being the civilian population. One Salvadoran officer remarked that as far as his forces are concerned, there is no sea, there's only fish. In other words, all people are seen as guerrillas, whether they are or not. Only this past week, on October 14th and 15th, 6 communities of displaced persons, internal refugees, were bombed by the Salvadoran military, who, according to information received from the Archdiocese of San Salvador, were flying 2 C-47 aircraft, capable of firing 1,500 rounds per minute, and 1 Vietnam-era gunship known as Puff the Magic Dragon, which spews out 18,000 rounds per minute. The planes were furnished by the U.S., and the Salvadorans who were on those planes as their crew members were trained in the United States in early this year. On October 14th in Morazan, a 60-year-old man and 2 boys, 6 and 12 years old, were killed in the air raids. 8 persons were wounded, 3 children between the ages of 9 and 6 months, 6 years, 5 women, 16 to 60 years old. The next day, on October 15th in San Miguel, 5 more communities were bombed. In one, a home was destroyed, resulting in the deaths of a 2-month-old and a 10-year-old boy, as well as the wounding of one of the daughters of the family. In another, 3 homes were bombed and the elementary school destroyed. Luckily, about 40 children had just left the school for the day. In Nicaragua, thousands have been killed since 1981. These added to the more than 40,000 killed in the last stages of the Somoza dictatorship. A recent editorial in the New York Times described the war and the role of the United States. It said, when it began in 1981, this war was described as strictly an internal affair. When CIA complicity could no longer be denied, the administration explained it was necessary to cut off an alleged arms flow from leftist Nicaragua to El Salvador. A side thing, this excuse that the arms flow was going from Nicaragua to El Salvador was demolished by David McMichael, a foreign CIA insurgency specialist in Nicaragua, who testified that he had found no credible evidence of arms flow in 2 years of work for the agency there. McMichael has recently testified before the World Court at The Hague. The editorial continues, the story began to teeter when Nicaragua's harbors were mined to scare away neutral shipping. Even that mining was falsely ascribed to Contras. Its authors were Americans. This is the New York Times speaking, not me. Then followed the infamous Contra Manual, ghostwritten by a CIA operative, counseling political murder. This ugly business was first denied and then finally blamed on overzealousness. Next came the false report that Soviet ships were carrying high-performance MiGs to Nicaragua. Now comes the news that for a year, the overt-covert war has been supervised by a military aide on the President's national security staff, who met frequently in Central America with Contra leaders, exerted tactical influence on their operations, and directed private donors to them. Congress said no to the secret war at one point. To shift conduct of these activities to the National Security Council is a sly, even a cynical evasion. The administration has chosen to mask war with whoppers, all the while condemning the Sandinistas as liars. The end of the New York Times quote. Why the Times editor should be surprised that the National Security Council is directing the Contra operation is amazing to me. The CIA is not an autonomous body. It follows the orders of the National Security Council. So anything that the CIA did was directed by that body. Both of these institutions, the CIA and the NSC, as I said, were created to direct national security policy, which the overt-covert war in Nicaragua clearly is. And thirdly, in Guatemala, since the U.S. overthrow the democratic government of that government in 1954, according to the Guatemalan Church in Exile, about 150,000 people have been murdered, again primarily by U.S.-backed forces and sometimes with direct U.S. military participation. In the late 60s, there was a counterinsurgency operation that our people took part in. According to the words of eyewitnesses of some of the most recent atrocities, the people are killed in Guatemala as if they are dangerous animals. For example, people are killed indiscriminately and their relatives are not allowed to bury the bodies. Before killing them, or in order to kill them, they are made to suffer. Some are decapitated, some are mutilated with machetes or axes, and others are beaten to death. The women are raped, regardless of their age or their health conditions. People are burned alive, or bodies of some victims are burned without checking to see if they are already dead. Children are burned alive or killed by blows. The smaller ones are hung by their feet, and they're swung head first against rocks or trunks of trees, breaking their skulls. Soldiers are trained to drink the blood of their victims in the presence of the people of the villages. One Guatemalan told the story that in his village, the army soldiers asked prisoners if they wanted a bullet or a pinch. Most, if not all, chose a pinch. Then the soldiers took them one by one and with a pair of pliers cut their jugular, making them bleed to death. There are many more examples that could be given of what the ideology of national security legitimates as action considered to be taken against those who are named as an enemy, because national security ideology sees everything in a state of war. Now, with regard to the other perspective, that of the poor, how do they perceive the world and how do they explain it? This particular perspective sees the world arising out of their own experience. They experience what they see daily in their lives. I'm going to give you some statistics about that world, which is the world that the poor live in. And it's how I see the world. I see the world in which the poor nations, known as the South, or the Third World, contain 2/3 of its people. And by the turn of the century, as Carolyn has mentioned, they will contain 4/5 of the human race. Most of these people live in what Robert McNamara, past president of the World Bank and a national security devotee of the 1960s, has classified as absolute and relative conditions of poverty. I see a world in which 1/4 of the people are rich and 3/4 are poor. That's mostly us. I see a world in which over half of the world's people live in nations which in 1981 had a per capita income of less than $300 per year. That 1/4 of those people live or die in nations with a per capita income of $166 per year. Figure out what that is. I see a world in which approximately 40,000 people die of hunger every day, and that's according to Jeanne at Tufts. That's about 14,600,000 per year. I make an aside on this because the bishops in my church and other people who side with the bishops talk about the 15 million, the 1.5 million, I guess, that have been killed by abortion in this country. We're talking about a yearly death toll by hunger of close to 15 million people. There's no major organization that they have sponsored to take care of that problem, as far as I know. Many, many more people live in a state of constant malnutrition. Why? Who decides that food is a commodity that must be bought in the marketplace? I see a world in which over 1 billion people are without basic medical care, and over 1 billion others have poor or inadequate medical care. The right to health, like the right to food, is sold as a commodity. If one has the money, then one can have the service. I see a world in which indecent and obscene housing has become the central symbol of poverty, as squalid slums and ramshackle shantytowns ring the periphery of every major city in the third world nations. I see a world in which over 40% or more of the world's population are illiterate, and of these, 2 out of every 3 are women. I see a world in which over 2 billion people do not have access to clean drinking water or to sanitation. I see a world in which more and more resources go into death-giving technology rather than that which is life-giving. Last year alone, the world spent over $850 billion on weapons, more than $2.5 billion per day. According to the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN in a 1980 report, the capital needed for investment in agriculture in developing countries, countries like Ethiopia, countries like Honduras, countries like Guatemala, is about 1.5 billion per year, compared with the current, is about 5 billion per year, compared with the current 1.7 billion. The New Internationalist wrote in 1980, the money required to provide food, water, education, health, and housing for everyone in the world has been estimated at $17 billion per year. It's a huge sum of money, about as much as the world spends on arms every 2 weeks. That's in 1980. This year we spend it in 1 week. To give these statistics a narrower focus, in Central America in 1979, out of a population of 25 million people, 20 million of those people are poor. 1 out of every 2 Central Americans 15 years of age or over is illiterate. 1 out of 8 children dies before the age of 1. 3 out of every 10 Central Americans are unemployed, and the rest of them are underemployed. 8 out of 10 are malnourished. 12 million of those 20 million are without proper housing. For every dollar that goes to the poor, the rich in Central America get $48. 70 to 90% of the land is owned by 2% of the people. 8.5 million people live in conditions of extreme and absolute poverty in Central America at this point. The reality of the people is one of massive poverty and repression. In the 1979 Puebla meeting, the Latin American bishops who met there provided a description of this reality in terms of Latin America as they were seeing it after the years that they had spent standing on the side of the poor, that decade, since 1968, when they took an auction for the poor. And they said, from the depths of the countries which make up Latin America, a cry is rising to heaven, growing louder and more alarming all the time. It is the cry of a suffering people who demand justice, freedom, and respect for the basic rights of human beings and peoples. The bishops at that conference clearly named the roots of the injustices for their people. They said they were inhuman and unjust political and economic systems, dependency of third world nations, multinationals, unequal terms of trade, the arms race with its devouring of scarce resources, lack of agrarian reform, capital flight, and human greed. Statements like those would keep the Brazilian bishops and other bishops out of this country, just as Margaret Randall's kept out. They would be labeled, and they are labeled, as communists. Basically what they mean by that is that they are against national security ideology. In the light of what they saw in Puebla and what they analyzed, the bishops reiterated their commitment to social change, a commitment they had made in 1968 at a place called Medellin in Colombia, when they called on the church to make a preferential option for the poor, and when they pledged itself and their resources in the struggle for the liberation of the poor from all forces of oppression and injustice. The history of that particular movement is coming out in an article that will be in Resist next month. It's one that I just wrote that gives the background in terms of how the bishops, a very conservative force, how the church in Latin America, a very conservative force, came to stand in a very different place and came to make an option that today is remarkable. Because of the option taken at Medellin, and in the years since Puebla, tens of thousands of people have been tortured, mutilated, killed, or disappeared in Latin America, and specifically in Central America. Now why? What have those people done? Basically what they've done is to organize the poor. And the poor have organized themselves into what we know in this country, and they are known as base communities. And all a base community does is to meet. And they meet just as community church meets. And they reflect on their reality. And they organize themselves to change that reality. And they organize in many, many different ways. They organize to take part in unions. They organize to take part in sodality groups. They organize to give Bible courses. They organize to take part in political movements, different kinds of things. But in that organization, something happens to the people involved in them. They become very conscious of the fact that they are human beings and that they have rights, and that their rights have to be met. And they take an option to struggle for those rights. That's what has happened once people have become aware of the situation that they are in. The major threat, as seen by those who hold this perspective, is poverty and exploitation of the many by the few. The option made by those who hold this perspective is to stand with the poor in their struggle to gain their rights and their dignity. Its project, the project of those who stand with the poor, is one which espouses life, which makes an option for life. That of the national security adherents, those people running our government and other places in the world right now, their project is a project of death. It is a project that espouses death. And everything that they do leads toward death. There is a struggle taking place between these two perspectives, as I said at the beginning. It's a struggle between national security, and it's a struggle between the rights of the poor. You can't have both, and we have to be very clear about that. We will either have what they call national security, or we will have a world in which the rights of the poor are secured. I'm of the opinion that if we have the latter, we will have a world of peace. Without it, we will not. We will be in a continual state of war, as they see it. But one sign of hope for me in all of the misery delineated in this talk that I just gave is that the emergence of the poor as an organized group is a very real reality. It is an inspiration to me and to those of us who stand with them. And that group is a threat to those in power. They are the threat that they see in their national security eyeglasses. Those in power realize that a new society is being born in the life and death struggle of these poor. They have made of Latin America, those in power, they have made it a land of heroes and a land of martyrs. But the spirit of the people who have died lives on in their people and in the struggle of those people. The poor hold out a vision of a new society. In Latin America, Leonardo Boff is a theologian who talks about a vision of a new church being born. And again, there's struggle taking place around that in the old church with the new church. He calls it an ecclesiogenesis, a birth of a church born from the struggle of the poor. What I say is happening is something broader than that. I think a sociogenesis is in progress throughout the world. The world is being born from the struggle of the poor. We have to decide whether we're going to be part of that struggle. Those of us in this room have decided. And what I'm going to say is that what we do is just continue to do what we're doing. But we have to realize that in order to change the reality of our world, in order to move away from a national security framework, a very deep cultural revolution has to take place in this country. The attitudes and the mindset of people have to be changed. And we have to move towards looking at the rights of the poor as the framework within which we operate and within which the institutions in our country and in our world will be fashioned out of. In closing, I'd like to read something from Miguel de Scoto. It was the message that he sent this year to the people in Nicaragua who were celebrating the anniversary, the 6th anniversary of the Sandinista Revolution. That revolution is a revolution, as far as I'm concerned, that is committed to the rights of the poor. And again, if you want information on that, there's much written in that document that I have over there. But Miguel wrote this, and I think he says it to us as well. After 6 years of efforts and advances, we are reunited to proclaim that Nicaragua is free and will always struggle to keep the liberty we won on July 19, 1979. Miguel was fasting for peace at this time. We give thanks to the God of life for having reached this day. We haven't been bought out. I am witness to the fact that U.S. imperialism has tried to tempt us into abandoning our revolutionary program and betraying our people. They have offered us security and money, and these have failed. They do not understand that this revolution has a treasure, the compassionate love for the life of the poor and for national sovereignty. This treasure is the heart of our revolution, and its heart has no price. The eyes of the world watch our small nation with great hope. God has chosen to lift Nicaragua above the horizon of history and turn it into a light for the poor of the earth, an example which nations look towards in their struggle for dignity. Thank you.